There was a terrifying shriek as Zibalba lifted from her perch and rose into the night sky. Don and Bubba darted for cover in the shadow of the stone. Don, the more agile of the two, vanished into a narrow crack between stone and sand. Bubba, somewhat less athletic, plunged with a loud splash into the water. A moment later, his head broke the surface, a silver arc squirting from his mouth.
"That's it for your gunpowder,"
Don remarked. Bubba emerged onto the shore with a light squish, squish of his dripping feet against the sand, ringing out his blunderbuss as he went, though exactly how he managed to do that is anyone's guess.
"Don't make no difference. I'd rather club with it anyway."
Don grunted and looked back up at the hill and its fortress.
"I'd feel a lot better if you could let off another blast, just in case the owl tries its luck again."
Don darted up the side of the hollow, an eager gleam in his eyes as he peered out into the night. He struck to the south, avoiding the light of the main entrance and keeping to the shadows. Bubba followed at a distance, laying low and just out of sight.
"Well, what do we have here?"
Don muttered to himself as he stalked along the foot of the hill. At the top of the wall he spotted an opening in the armadillo plates, where a lone sentry stood watch.
"Someone not invited to the party?"
Don knocked an arrow and took aim. The line of sight wasn't quite right. He could easily picture the arrow bouncing off a bit of rock or bone. Eventually the sentry stepped out of sight, and Don lowered his bow.
"Not yet,"
he muttered. Don motioned for Bubba to join him. Gesturing towards the top of the wall, he whispered,
"Got a rope."
"And hook,"
Bubba answered, holding up a metal grappling hook fastened to the end of a cord. Don swung the hook around a few times as he scanned the top of the wall. Eventually settling on a spot, he slung it as high as he could manage. The hook bounced off the side of an armadillo hide and dropped to the ground with a light thud. Don made a second attempt, which also failed, and eagerly squeezed against the side of the wall. 2 pairs of eyes peered down from the opening, scanning the ground for intruders. As silently as shadows, Don and Bubba slunk away to the south in search of another spot.
"You try this time,"
Don muttered to Bubba. Taking the rope, Bubba peered up at the top of the wall, swung the hook around several times, and sent it flying like shot from a gun. He waited a moment for the hook to fall back down, then gave the rope a cautious tug and nodded to Don. Slinging his bow across his shoulders, Don took hold of the rope and began the short climb, with Bubba following a few moments later. Once at the top, Don inched to the side, holding on to the edge of the bony plates as he looked over the fortress's interior. Several small buildings lay below his perch. In any other settlement, Don would have called them houses. But East Hill was no ordinary town. Its inhabitants were mostly men, and highly disciplined, militant men at that. Don knew this, for he had once trained them himself. Many months ago he had come across the decimated commune, whose people were as helpless as children. Having suffered a similar loss, Don taught them to fight. Plows were melted down and hammered into axes, scythes repurposed into glaives and spears. Those buildings were not houses but barracks. To the north end of this living space, a broad stairway led down to the main entrance, and beyond that another stairway led back up. The stonework of the little streets and plazas was unparalleled, for the mice of East Hill were unmatched artisans. A narrow walkway ran along the wall, just under Don's perch. He could see a handful of sentries keeping watch at openings along the armadillo hide, much like the one he considered taking a shot at. Don grunted, his brow furrowing.
"It's never easy."
Glancing to Bubba, he whispered,
"Any ideas?"
Bubba stared long and hard, watching the motions of the sentries.
"They're focused out, not in. If it were good and quiet, we could drop down and no one would be the wiser."
Don looked Bubba's pack over. He could just picture its contents rattling about with every motion.
"Guess you'll have to sit this one out, then."
"For now."
Don looked back down. When the opportune moment presented itself, he slipped over the side of the armadillo hide and dropped down onto the wall. From there, he leapt to an adjacent rooftop and slid down between two buildings. Just like that, he was in. Don readied his bow in his left hand and drew a knife in his right. Very quietly, he nosed about the entrances of the buildings on either side. Both were empty, for the trial of Elizabeth Hartley was a highly anticipated event. Don heaved a sigh of relief. There had been no one to hear him scurrying across the roofs. Don kept close to the walls as he struck out to the north. He found the main gate lightly guarded. There was only a single mouse keeping watch, more to admit those coming in than to protect the fortress from enemies without. Don silently sheathed his knife and slung his bow across his back. Quiet as a shadow, he crept up behind the mouse and grabbed him from behind. One arm curled around the mouse's neck, while Don's free hand muffled his victim's mouth. Don hid the unconscious mouse in a dark corner and proceeded to raise the portcullis. Don cast a cautious glance to either side along the wall. No one seemed to notice his antics. With that, he slipped out into the night, making his way south along the wall until he found the telltale rope hanging down. Don gave the rope a tug and gestured for Bubba to join him. The two then slipped back inside the keep, leaving the exit wide open. From there they scurried off, up the north stairway, back onto the landing. The fire of the brazier had gone out by now, leaving the courtyard and amphitheater pitch black. As Don and Bubba rushed along, they did not see the thin white line marking the safe path across the courtyard. All at once, Don felt the floor shift under his feet. As he moved to leap back, it gave out under his weight, and he tumbled with a terrified yell into the depths below. Don landed with a crash in a deep, sandy pit. All around, he could make out the dim outlines of bones scattered about the gloom. In the shadowy corners, he could hear the sounds of clicking, chittering, and squealing.
"Bubba,"
Don whispered urgently.
"I don't think I'm alone down here."
"I ain't alone up here," Bubba called back.
There was a low thud as he landed next to Don. All at once, the roof of the chamber collapsed, showering bits of cobblestone down throughout the pit, revealing a narrow walkway supported by a row of pillars running down the middle. Flames leapt up around the edges of the walls, and hundreds of eyes gazed down at Don and Bubba.
"Mr. Copper,"
Matthias' voice floated down to greet them.
"We meet again."
In her cage high above, Elizabeth heard the voices and could see into the arena, for that is what it was.
Don?
She blinked, hardly believing her eyes.
Don!
Yet Elizabeth's elation at seeing him alive and well after all this time was short-lived. Matthias shot a cruel glare in her direction and then shouted to his men,
"Open the first gate!"
Chains rattled and gears ground as 4 strong mice strained against a winch on the east side of the arena. In the pit below, Don could just barely make out a crude, pale portcullis of bones, slowly rising, and a multitude of glittering black eyes peering out from behind.
Bubba?"
He spoke up, tapping his partner on the shoulder.
"How's the gunpowder coming?"
Bubba squeezed his powder horn, sending a squirt of water spouting from the tip.
"Still wet."
4 long, hairy, multi-jointed limbs unfolded from behind the portcullis. The sandy ground hissed and sizzled as venom dripped from a pair of giant fangs.
"Tarantula tango?"
Bubba piped up. Don knocked an arrow and shook his head.
"That one only works if one of us can get behind it. Tank and volley.
Glancing to Bubba, he added,
And since your powder's wet, that makes you the tank.
Don tossed Bubba a knife.
Good luck."
And it was on. Bubba darted forward, knife in one hand, blunderbuss in the other, harrying the tarantula as it tried to emerge into the open. He cut savagely at its legs, following up with harsh blows from his gun barrel. Despite its size advantage, the tarantula backed away for just a moment. Then an arrow whistled in, blinding one of its eyes. The tarantula gave a shriek, legs curling back to protect its face, as more arrows whistled in. Bubba, however, leapt back, for the tarantula's legs were positioned to spring forward with enough force to bowl a mouse over, and then, like lightning, it could strike with its fangs. Don halted his volley, knowing he could do no more until the tarantula exposed itself. The creature let out a faint whine as it retreated into the dark, shielding itself with 3 legs, while a 4th rubbed its injured eye. Then Matthias' voice sounded from above. "Raise the 2nd gate!" Don heard the rattling of another portcullis grinding open behind him, and something else, a crunching, clicking, snapping of chitin. Don glanced over his shoulder, and his heart nearly stopped. From out of the darkness came a creeping horror, its armored hide as sleek and black as a living shadow, its savage pincers stretching open before it as it advanced, and a fat, venomous tail curling over its back.
"We've got company, Bubba!"
Don shouted, and quick as a flash he shot an arrow straight down the scorpion's throat. It gagged and staggered, but as Don was distracted, the tarantula lunged forward, legs fanning out in a sudden aggressive burst, sending Bubba rocking back on his heels as he leapt back. Don whirled about, letting another arrow fly and blinding another of the giant spider's eyes.
"Don! Look out!"
Elizabeth's voice ripped through the sounds of shouting and jeering amongst the vengeful mice. And just in time, too. Don glanced over his shoulder just in time to see the scorpion's stinger rushing in. It punched clear through a support beam as he rolled aside, coming up quickly to fire an arrow for its eyes. But the scorpion was observant and had forelimbs stronger than those of a tarantula. A single great pincer batted the arrow aside and sent it clattering against the ground.
"Bubba!"
Don barked.
"Your powder better be ready soon."
"Yin and yang!" Bubba shouted back as he darted between the support beams. Don quickly connected the dots and dashed south towards the west side of the arena, while Bubba led the tarantula on a merry chase northwards along the east side. The eager scorpion and its spider cousin pursued their marks without hesitation. The scorpion struck again and again, lunging with its tail, and making grabs for Don as he dodged this way and that. Both mice rushed for the center of the arena, leading the arachnids on a collision course. As the spider lunged and the scorpion lashed out, Don and Bubba darted in opposite directions, leaving an empty space for the scorpion and tarantula to collide. The stinger buried itself deep in the tarantula's carapace, and the spider let out a final whine as a lethal dose of venom coursed into its body. The scorpion, losing interest in the mice in favor of its dead adversary, proceeded to tear the tarantula to pieces. Don heaved a sigh of relief, while Bubba wiped the chill sweat from his brow. Their reprieve was short-lived. "Raise the 3rd gate!" Don shot Matthias a dirty look.
Seriously, how many gates are there?
Then an ear-splitting roar ripped through the night air, bringing a heavy silence down on the gathering. The scorpion froze, looking up from its meal, and clicking frantically. The scorpion had never lived in the gorge, nor had it faced the monster that dwelled there, yet some instinct in the back of its rudimentary mind told it that this roar was the sound of a predator. Abandoning its abundant meal, the scorpion scurried back into its chamber, seized the portcullis with a mighty pincer, and wrenched it free of the chains that held it open. Don grinned.
"I never thought I'd be relieved to hear that roar."
Above, the gathering of mice grew agitated, whispering amongst themselves, "He's here! He's here!" The memory of the mouse that once defeated their leader was still fresh on their minds. Matthias, however, grew irritated as he saw his men freezing in the face of his old enemy's approach. "I said raise the 3rd gate!" he barked. "Or wasn't I clear?" As the mice on the east side of the arena obeyed, Matthias darted across the walkway, murder flashing in his eyes as he rushed to meet the one mouse he feared. In the arena below, there came a low hiss as a young rattlesnake surged out from its hole in the wall. Don rolled his eyes to the sky.
Where does he get these things?
Above, several mice abandoned the arena, flanking either side of Matthias as backup. As they approached the stairs down to the entryway, a handful of the mice broke away to circle around the other side. A second howl, this one far closer, sapped Matthias' momentum. The ancient mouse ground to a sudden halt as he spotted Monster's twisted jaws rising up the stairway to meet him. Yet there was something different about the huge mouse. A look of immense satisfaction crossed Matthias' face as he took note of Monster's faltering, limping gait.
"You were a fool to come here,"
Monster answered with a grim nod.
"That makes two of us. Peter, now!"
A heavy weight dropped from overhead, drawing an attached rope down one side of a complex rigging of block and tackle. Too late did Matthias look down at the ground and see the thick silken ropes. Too late did he look back at his men and shout, "Retreat!" The corners of a thickly woven web flew up around them on all sides, and in an instant Matthias and his followers were dangling from a strong beam, all of them entangled in the dense net. Matthias wailed in rage as the large form of a rat darted underneath him, followed momentarily by a mouse. She paused a moment, and then turned back to help Monster on his way.
"Astrid!" Matthias roared. "You traitorous wench!"
She cast a faltering glance up at him, a small part of her still loyal to the dead commune. Then she was off again, Monster's injured arm slung across her shoulder.
"You'll pay for this!" Matthias continued to rant at Astrid's back. "I swear it!"
The mice did not see Peter approach the arena, his dark fur blending in with the night. A small form leapt from his shoulder and scurried forward. Distracted as they were, the nearest mice didn't notice the tiny spider scuttling amongst them, trailing netting behind him as he slipped and hopped about between their legs. Then the pale form of Monster drew up alongside Peter, and the furthest mice pointed and shouted from the other side of the pit. Chaos broke out as the nearest mice turned to see the intruders. Caught unawares, they fumbled for their weapons, which had already been entangled in spider webs. In the process, hands were caught up, feet were ensnared, and in the mad rush the mice tumbled and stumbled to the floor. As the remaining mice rushed to the attack, Monster and Astrid took up positions at the narrow edges of the pit to hold them off. Monster, despite lacking a weapon, batted aside his first assailant's glaive with his good arm. Seizing the shaft, he then spun the weapon about, flinging his adversary high and far over his head. Astrid, meanwhile, took advantage of her opponent's awkward position as he staggered along the narrow walkway amongst numerous fallen and wriggling bodies. It was an easy matter to trip him over one foot and send him tumbling into the pit below.
Aye!
3 heads turned as the mouse landed. Don motioned to the still form.
Well, go for him. He's easier prey than I am.
The serpent regarded the fallen mouse for a moment, and then turned back to Don with a vicious grin.
"You think me a mere animal?"
I think if the shoe fits.
Don paused, noting the serpent's lack of feet.
Never mind.
The rattlesnake lunged for Don, fangs flashing out for the kill. The agile mouse, however, darted aside, deflecting the nearest fang with a slash of a knife. The snake shrieked as the blade cut into its flesh, crashing headlong into the nearest pillar. There arose a howl from overhead as Monster leapt into the pit, the blade of his glaive leading the way. The snake gathered its senses just long enough to look up and see its death come crashing down on its head. Don let out a heavy breath.
Thanks for that.
On the walkway above, Peter let out a shrill whistle. "Matrix! Astrid! Let's be off!" The little spider scurried back to Peter, leaping up his side, back, and finally his shoulder. Astrid threw a final punch, sending her next attacker tumbling into the abyss. Then she ran to join up with Peter as he led the way across the narrow walkway. A mouse shouted a command, and those remaining on the other side filed onto the little bridge to cut off Peter's advance. Matrix met them head-on, leaping from Peter's shoulder to the first mouse, a line of web trailing from his abdomen. The little spider poked the mouse in the eyes before leaping to the next, and the one after that. As the first mouse blinked frantically, Peter rushed upon him, sweeping the mouse's feet out from under him. As he fell over the side of the walkway, the mouse dragged a chain of his compatriots after him, each one drawn aside by Matrix's growing line of silk. In short order, there was nothing standing between Peter and the other side, save for a satisfied little spider rubbing his forelimbs together after a job well done. Peter scooped up Matrix as he passed, advancing into the amphitheater. A lone mouse stood watch by the winch, armed with a short sword. As he rushed to attack Peter, the rat drew open his jacket, and a little ball of fur and fury sprang out, bowling over the surprised mouse and biting his nose. Amid the struggles of shrew and mouse, Astrid crept upon the prone combatants, and knocked the mouse unconscious with a blow from her sword's pommel. Stu rolled off his defeated adversary and heaved a sigh of relief.
Nice one!
Peter looked up at the cage and called out,
Hold on, Bess! I'm not quite sure how to let this down gently.
Elizabeth gulped, wrapping her arms around the bar and squeezing her eyes shut. Peter pulled a lever, releasing the gears that held the winch in place. In an instant, the cage plummeted down, to crash open in the middle of the amphitheater.
Lisbeth!
Stu shouted, hobbling to his feet.
You're all right, Lisbeth?
She was indeed all right, up to a point. Elizabeth was bruised from her landing and nauseous as her belly rippled and jiggled like a mound of gelatin.
As much as I would like to let you rest, Peter remarked, helping Elizabeth to her feet, I'm afraid we're under a bit of a time crunch. Come now, as quickly as you can manage.
That wasn't especially quick. Peter led the way, Matrix riding on his shoulder, while Elizabeth waddled after him across the narrow walkway. Astrid scooped Stu into her arms as she darted past, drawing an initial look of intense shock from the shrew. A moment later, however, his expression mellowed into a contented grin. As they crossed the walkway, Stu called down to Monster,
Hey, dummy! I got your girl!
Astrid couldn't help a faint giggle as Monster roared his response up at them.
There, lady, I got him good and jealous,
Stu whispered to her with a wink. When at last Astrid set foot on the other side, the narrow bridge gave a great groan of splintering wood, and the far end collapsed. Elizabeth jumped in alarm.
What was...
All a part of the plan.
Astrid assured her. Nodding down toward the pit, she added,
Have a look.
As Elizabeth looked down, her heart leapt. Don led the way as three forms clambered up the remains of the walkway, followed by Bubba. Monster brought up the rear, struggling against his own weight and injured limbs. Elizabeth staggered backwards, making room as Don bounded up to greet her with a tight bear hug.
It's really you!
She breathed.
And you?
Don cried. After a moment's pause, he let go and looked down.
Is it just my imagination, or is it kind of hard to get close to you?
Elizabeth grinned coyly.
Don, are you calling me fat?
Well, as if the shoe fits.
Then put it on and run for your lives!
Stu cut Don off, pointing ahead. A group of mice stood gathered in their path, old Matthias standing at their head. As you'll recall, when he was rushing to confront Monster, several of his men had circled around the other side of the landing to cut off the invaders from behind. Clearly, that wasn't all they cut off. The cord suspending Matthias and his men in their net had been severed, freeing them.
So, you thought you could escape us, Matthias boomed. I'm afraid not. You still have a great deal to answer for.
Stand aside, old-timer.
Don shouted, knocking an arrow.
I don't want to hurt you.
Matthias cocked his head to the side.
Perhaps not, but I do want to hurt you.
Don released his bowstring, sending an arrow flying. Matthias simply batted it aside with his cane as Don stared in disbelief.
You know, maybe it's time I chose a better weapon.
Step aside,
Elizabeth whispered to him, placing a hand on Don's shoulder. Don instinctively reached for a knife.
I can take him. He must be, 500 years old?
Don,
Elizabeth squeezed his shoulder.
I have a plan.
Don looked to the others.
Seriously, we're just going to let her fight off how many mice in her condition?
Come forward,
Matthias called out, stepping forward and tossing his cane aside.
If you would confront your fate, then so be it.
Elizabeth stepped past Don, despite his objections and the protests of Monster and Stu. Peter, however, eyed her with curiosity.
Has everyone gone crazy?
Astrid whispered to Matrix. The spider just shrugged. Elizabeth drew 1 foot back, waiting as Matthias circled from side to side. The old mouse suspected something. After sizing her up, he bent low and leapt forward, one foot leading the way. Elizabeth swung her back foot to the front, heaving back on her shoulders and forward with her hips. There was a great rubbery boing as her belly collided with Matthias' foot, ripples flashing across her skin as if on water, radiating outward from the impact of a pebble. Matthias' eyes bulged as he felt the opposing force rushing back against his ill-advised kick. Then he let out a wail of despair and rage as he bounced off Elizabeth's belly and flew like a cannonball through his men, bowling them over and clearing a path more efficiently than even the savage monster could have managed.
Now, run!
Don shouted as he and Bubba rushed forward. They grabbed Elizabeth under her arms, half dragging her after them as they darted between those mice left standing. Monster lurched through next, driving Matthias' terrified men before him with bestial howls and terrifying swipes of his glaive. Peter and Astrid eagerly followed after. Matthias screamed helplessly as his prisoners passed, but to no avail. His men regained their feet too late, and those that had not been downed were fleeing for their lives as Monster's hot breath rushed down their necks. But Elizabeth and her friends had not escaped yet, for Matthias had one more weapon in his arsenal. He closed his eyes and thought of blood and murder untold. Suddenly he could see from high above. He saw as an owl sees. The caravan of mice and company fled across the sands far below him. "Kill them," the ancient mouse growled. "Kill them, all of them!" An unearthly screech ripped through the night air, and a shadow passed across the moon as Xibalba dove for her prey.
Take cover!
Don shouted.
Follow us, it isn't far from here.
Monster paused in his tracks, turning and lashed out with his weapon as the owl rushed for him. There was a shriek, and the owl rose once more on the night winds. Astrid froze, whirling about, and screamed.
Monster!
He was still there, but he had been knocked down by the impact. Astrid rushed to his side to help the huge mouse to his feet, while Stu wailed in abject horror. "It's coming again! It's coming again!" Back in the keep, Matthias' lips drew tight against his teeth in a cruel grin. He saw the two mice huddling on the ground, rushing up at Xibalba. He felt the owl's talons stretch wide, and then his grin vanished as he saw the arrow rushing into his face. Xibalba wheeled away as two screams ripped forth, one from her throat, the other from the forbidding keep on the hill. "Nice shot!" Peter exclaimed, patting Don on the back.
I know.
The mouse rubbed his knuckles against his shoulder, gazing haughtily down his nose. Xibalba circled for a final rush, but too late. Monster, the last straggler, had just slipped away under the boulder at the edge of a shallow pool in a small hollow. The owl splashed through the water, leaping and clawing at the boulder in vain while her quarry huddled together just out of reach. Astrid buried her face in Monster's shoulder, whimpering softly.
What do we do now?
We wait.
Dawn announced.
The owl can't reach us under here. We just have to last until morning, and it'll leave.
Unless Matthias takes advantage of this to regroup,
Monster grumbled. Then a light flickered on in Peter's eyes as he glanced down at Astrid and the shrew held in her arms. "Stu, didn't we discuss a course of action earlier today, before being interrupted by the solarfuge?" Stu paused a moment. "What, y'all want me to dig? In my condition?" Peter smirked. "Would you do it for a Stubby snack?" Ultimately that proved unnecessary. Despite Matthias' zeal, the pain of an arrow in the eye weighed heavily on both Xibalba and the ancient mouse. As the pain of each fed into one another, Matthias and his owl's resolve entered a downward spiral, each one pulling the other down, down into oblivion. As two of his men hauled Matthias to their barracks to tend to his wounds, Xibalba likewise took to the wing, fleeing to a safe place to recover. With a heavy silence settling over the hollow, Bubba emerged to check for threats. A moment later he turned back and called to the others. "All clear?" Don was the next one out, circling the hollow and clambering atop the stone, just to be sure. Peter followed, casting a wary eye to the east and the jagged shadow on the skyline. "I realize you must all be terribly tired," he remarked, "but I think it's best we put some ground between ourselves and East Hill."
"Agreed," Monster grumbled. "Matthias knows where we are. We can't afford to give him time to organize more men to come after us."
Do we have to?" Stu whined. Elizabeth was inclined to agree with the shrew. Her stomach ached with the near-constant exertions following her binge. Yet she couldn't argue with Peter's logic. Thus the little band set out, fighting against their exhaustion as they trudged west for the ravine. Don scouted ahead, picking out numerous rest stops along the way to keep the long walk from growing too long. The rising sun brought with it many questions among the inhabitants of the ravine, and with those many stories and rumors. It also brought an apocalyptic hangover to Ralph, the kangaroo rat, as he crawled out of a dumpster. He could not bring himself to hop as he entered Yip and Yap's, and so he was forced to shuffle. "Coffee?" Yap asked with a sly grin, as Ralph settled onto a bar stool. Ralph nodded, burying his face in his hands. "Never again," he slurred. "I'll never drink another drop." As he looked down the bar, however, Ralph spotted Saul Morden nursing a drink of his own. Looking back up to Yap, Ralph interjected, "I'll have what he's having." "Bad luck?" Yap asked, bringing out a mug and a fresh brew. "I hear he pulled a pro bono job last night." Ralph grimaced as he sipped at his mug. "Pro what?" "Beaten and battered, broke a rib, and for what?" Yap grinned. "He came back empty-handed, 'cause he chickened out at the last moment." Saul shot a warning glare in Yap's direction, silencing the ferret's giggles.
"The boys wanted me to step into their little castle. I told them no. Then the boss man's owl showed up."
"And then?" Ralph asked, curious. Saul took a sip.
"So what about you two? Still counting your losses?"
Yap grimaced as the sound of Yip's angry growling rumbled from the kitchen. Don't ask, 'kay?" A bell tinkled as the doors swung open, and 3 figures strode in. A number of early risers looked up, taking note of the new arrivals. And then the rumors really flew. Elizabeth Hartley, somewhat slimmed down after the night's long walk, leaned against the counter on one side of Saul, fixing him with a glare that would have curdled milk. Saul barely noticed.
"So," he muttered, "you got away."
Elizabeth nodded with a curt,
I did.
Saul raised his cup.
"Cheers. That's a new one for people to talk about."
Elizabeth pursed her lips.
Don't you feel anything?
Saul nodded.
"I feel cheated. You were a prime catch, hun."
Elizabeth sighed in disgust.
I don't understand you.
"Just business," Saul shrugged. "Nothing personal. It's all part of the game."
So that's what this is to you?
Elizabeth asked.
Just a game?
"Yep.
Saul took another sip.
Good to see you up and around, you know. Matthias cheated me, and then he lost. It's poetic."
Elizabeth's brow furrowed. She said nothing more, but simply rose from her seat and walked away.
"Hey, Hartley," Saul called after her. "I really do like you, you know."
Elizabeth's only response was the door swinging shut behind her. But there were still 2 other people to deal with, and they were not nearly as forgiving.
Do you have any idea how much she means to me?
A low voice growled at Saul's back. The bounty hunter swiveled about on his stool just in time to see Don lunge for him, pinning him to the bar and pressing a knife to his throat.
I should kill you.
Don breathed.
Right here, right now.
Don was answered with a light click, and the cold sensation of a gun barrel pressing against his stomach. Saul grinned.
"Put it away, son."
Don hesitated.
"Let's put it this way. What matters more to you, You found your girl, saved her from the bad guys, and now you can all live happily ever after. Or we can kill each other over some misguided quest for revenge. What'll it be?"
Don looked down at the metal rod, then back up at the knife.
"Choose quickly, son. My trigger finger's itching."
Don's eyes narrowed as he pulled his knife away and took a step back.
This isn't over, Saul.
Saul shrugged.
Sure it is. You're moving up, boy. My best wishes go with you.
Don rolled his shoulders forward, pulling his vest tighter around himself, and stormed out the doors, leaving only little Stu behind, wearing a rather suspicious grin. Saul scowled down at the shrew.
Well, what do you want?
Just to show y'all a magic trick, Stu answered.
Observe, a simple deck of cards.
The cards sprang into the air in a rush of numbers and symbols. The only trick about it, however, was that it served as a distraction. Saul yelped as he felt a painful sting in his leg. He fired wildly into the air, shooting out a couple windows and shattering several bottles. Stu, however, scampered unharmed out the door, while Saul's bullet chambers spun and the gun clicked impotently with the last of its bullets gone. Saul slapped the weapon down on the bar, shuddering as he saw the marks of Stu's teeth in his leg. The shrew had broken the skin, and the wound was slightly discolored. Saul gulped as he felt his leg growing stiff and sore.
Is there a doctor in the house?
The bounty hunter shouted. Where the fur had been ground off during his fight with Monster, Saul could see his veins turning black as a dose of venom coursed through them. Gazing about the diner in a panic, he called out,
I think the runt poisoned me. Someone help. I need a doctor.
The other customers just shrugged at each other, indifferent. But there was one rather large, gaunt rat who took a keen interest in Saul's predicament. He had been sitting huddled in a corner, a black fedora pulled low over his brow. Now he unfolded himself, not unlike a lawn chair, his motions accompanied by a loud whirring and clicking as he staggered over to the bar, trench coat flapping at his sides with each motion. The rat leaned against the bar and helped himself to the last of Saul's drink with a confident smirk. Saul could hardly have cared less.
You a doctor?
The rat shrugged. You could say that.
Please, help me.
The rat eyed Saul for a moment, the corner of his mouth tugging into a cruel half-smile. Reaching into his coat with a metal, blade-like hand, he produced a scrap of paper with the words "Wanted" printed across the top, hanging over a remarkable likeness of Saul, followed by a rather large number. Tell me, Mr. Morden, how much is your life worth to you? Outside, Don froze in his tracks as he heard the gunshots, just as Stu scampered up alongside him.
Something happened in there?
Stu grinned and shrugged.
I don't know nothing, pal.
Don eyed the shrew for a moment, and then turned back to the course ahead.
Hey, Liz, wait up.
Elizabeth had gone a fair way ahead of the others, putting as much space between herself and Saul Morden as she could manage. Her face was red with rage as she leaned over the railing, gazing at the street below. At the sound of Don's voice, she looked up and hastily fought to soften her harsh expression. Elizabeth didn't want Don to be greeted with her rage. Don leaned against the rail for a moment. The look on Elizabeth's face had not escaped him. Then he glanced to a nearby ladder and back.
Come with me.
Elizabeth raised a curious eyebrow in response.
Just come this way,
Don repeated, sliding down the ladder. After another moment's hesitation, Elizabeth followed, somewhat awkwardly as her belly pressed against each step going down. Don led her across the street, up another ladder, and along the walkway to a respectable but securely locked little dwelling.
There's someone here you may want to see,
Don explained as he knocked at the door. As the locks and latches slid open, Elizabeth cast a skeptical look Don's way. She recognized the snowy white mouse that answered the door.
May North? Why would I want to see her?
Hello to you, too, May grumbled back. Don grinned as he leaned against the doorframe.
Miss North, sweetheart, can you tell the kids I found her?
At this, he nodded to Elizabeth. May glanced to Elizabeth, then back to Don, and nodded with a weary sigh. Come in, then.
Sweetheart?
Elizabeth repeated to Don with a raised eyebrow.
Only friends.
Don assured her.
She always wanted to be more, but hey, my heart's spoken for.
No sooner had Elizabeth stepped inside than she heard an excited squeal of, "Miss Hartley!" Elizabeth broke out in a smile wide enough to rival her gut as she saw little Chrissy come rushing up to her. Elizabeth bent down to give her old student and companion from her very first adventure a warm hug. Hanging further back, she spotted a ruggedly handsome young man, slimmed considerably by his own adventures on the road. But there was no mistaking Will's mischievous smirk. He joined Elizabeth and Chrissy in a tight group hug, as all three shed tears of joy at this most unexpected, yet welcome reunion. Not that far away, the ruined amphitheater sat empty, save for one occupant. Matthias sat a final time in his throne, leaning heavily on his cane and gazing silently into the empty air. His eyes had grown red and tired, and his very soul ached. "Matthias!" The voice of Gustav took the old mouse out of the moment, drawing his attention to the former blacksmith as he strode into the amphitheater. Matthias closed his eyes with a low groan and looked down on Gustav. "The men have been talking," the former blacksmith announced. "They say this Saul Morden had a chance to kill Monster, and you ordered the Bulba to stop him." Matthias' brow furrowed into a scowl, and he nodded. "So I did." Gustav was silent for a moment, his bluster and conviction abandoning him with Matthias' ready admission. "Why?" Matthias looked away, gazing across the sands to the distant gully and the little town built there. "He took something from me. I want it back." Gustav stared blankly at the old mouse. "You don't understand." Gustav shook his head. Matthias turned his weary eyes back to Gustav. "I fear him. I have confronted predators of all stripes. Cats, snakes, and now an owl. But never before have I been bested by another mouse." "So you want him dead?" Gustav guessed. "Then why would—" "I want him dead by my hand," Matthias barked, rising to his feet. "If he were to die any other way, he would haunt me to the end of time." Matthias fell silent for a moment and collapsed back into his throne. "I need to face him again. I need to destroy him, or I will always wonder, will always suspect that I've lost some vital edge, that I'm growing weak." Gustav watched Matthias for a time. The old mouse closed his eyes and said no more. Gustav bowed and left, his heart shaken. This was the first time Matthias hadn't been an all-powerful leader. The first time he wasn't totally confident. The first time he was weak. Gustav didn't like that at all. He began to wonder if, perhaps, it was time for someone else to take the ancient mouse's place.